Imagine waking up one day and finding out that the person who swore to love you forever not only abandoned you, but betrayed you in a cruel way, planning to erase you from your own life and steal everything you built. This is the true story of a woman who was pulled from the top to the bottom of the well, but what no one expected is that she would come back. And when she returned, it was to destroy those who tried to bury her alive. If you like strong stories full of twists and revenge, just leave the like now and subscribe to the channel, because what you will see here, it's just unbelievable. Now, get ready, because the story begins now. Airplanes crossing the sky, cars speeding on endless roads, people running from one side to the other, living their frenetic routines. In the midst of this turmoil, there was Alice, a woman who had always believed in the strength of her own effort to achieve her dreams. She smiled as she recalled how it all began. The small improvised kitchen where she tested recipes and served friends, and how this passion became a famous restaurant chain. Success had not come overnight. It was the result of sleepless nights, busy days, and above all, an unwavering will to win. Alice had a firm, almost obstinate personality. Its restaurants, spread across several elegant neighborhoods, were recognized not only for their tasty dishes, but also for their welcoming atmosphere. Every detail, from the lighting of the tables to the choice of spices, reflected the owner's careful look. And Gabriel, her husband, the one she believed she loved unconditionally, was always around, applauding every achievement, celebrating every victory. However, life has twists and turns that no one foresees. One day, all the glow seemed to wither. A brutal accident on a highway began a succession of grim pains and twists. Alice's car was hit head-on by another runaway vehicle, an impact that left irreparable marks. When she opened her eyes in a hospital room, she saw only a pile of machines and felt unbearable pain run down her spine. Then came the diagnosis. The collision had seriously damaged his spine. Alice was paralyzed from the waist down. Gabriel, the man who had sworn to take care of her in any circumstance, began to change. At first, he tried to show some dedication, but the visits to the hospital quickly became more spaced out. There came a time when his words of comfort sounded hollow, half-hearted. That hurt more than the paralysis itself. Alice's routine turned into endless physiotherapy sessions, strong meds, and a growing silence at home. What was once noisy, laughter, conversation, clinking pots in the experimental kitchen, now seemed dead. She no longer had the strength to run the restaurants personally, and Gabriel offered to help her take care of everything. He said he would do this to lighten his burden. But something was wrong, and that something soon got a name: Teodoro, Gabriel's father. A man who, from the beginning, carried a calculating look, as if he saw the world as a board ready to be manipulated. Theodore showed no sympathy for his daughter-in-law. On the rare occasions when he appeared in restaurants, he showed coldness and a certain disdain. With Alice's accident, that patriarch observed the situation like a vulture that prowls its wounded prey. He began to exert an increasing influence over his son. He began with subtle phrases, whispered at key moments. "Gabriel, you're too young to be tied to a life of sacrifice. She's not going to walk anymore. Is that really what you want for the rest of your days?" As Alice struggled to relearn the basics, how to turn her wheelchair, how to reach for objects, how to handle the bath herself, Teodoro planted seeds of doubt in Gabriel's mind. And Gabriel, faced with pressure, guilt, and his own insecurities, began to consider his father's ideas. The plan Theodore proposed was sordid: sedate Alice so that she could not question financial and administrative decisions, transfer her assets to Gabriel's name, claiming that it was for her good, and finally, to intern her in a distant asylum, off the radar of any acquaintance, so that she would simply be forgotten. Gabriel vacillated, hesitated, but gradually gave in to his father's arguments. In the midst of mental confusion, stunned by Alice's condition and the prospect of having to take care of her for the rest of her life, he eventually accepted this wicked plan. With Teodoro's approval, the sneaky steps began: the tampering of documents, the withdrawal of significant amounts from Alice's accounts, the forgery of signatures. Meanwhile, Alice was kept under the influence of increasingly strong medicines, feeling lost and increasingly confused. It was a terrifying night in which Alice's last spark of hope was completely extinguished. Gabriel disappeared. He simply left the house, taking personal belongings, papers, without saying goodbye. The next day, Teodoro appeared with a medical team and a private ambulance. Alice, dizzy from so many medicines, could hardly react. He didn't know where he was going. He just felt the vehicle shaking along the roads, on a trip too long for someone in his state. When the ambulance parked, Alice was already plunged into a deep daze. She was taken inside an old building with yellowed walls and a musty smell, where she stayed in a tiny room with barred windows. It was an asylum far from the city, isolated in a rural area. There, the corridors were silent and humid, filled only with the sound of old televisions, shuffling footsteps, and occasional coughs from other residents. That became Alice's new prison. Days and nights merged into a gray stream. The nurses didn't care about her story. They treated her as another invalid in the line of the forgotten. The place was supported by donations and the monthly fee paid by Teodoro and Gabriel. None of them appeared there. It seemed evident that their goal was for Alice to perish gradually, drugged and hopeless, until a spark of change emerged. On a cold and silent afternoon, a volunteer lawyer named Leonardo visited the nursing home to offer legal assistance to anyone who needed it. He did this social work because of his family past. He had grown up seeing injustices and had sworn to dedicate his career to fighting situations of abandonment and manipulation. As he walked through the corridors, Leonardo noticed Alice. There was something in her eyes, even blurred by the medicines, that caught his attention. It was as if, despite all that pain, there was a latent anger and a desire to scream for help. He approached her carefully. "Good afternoon, my name is Leonardo. Would you like to talk to me?" Alice initially retreated, suspicious. Who, after all, would be interested in her, whom even her husband had abandoned? But Leonardo had a different attitude. There was no pity in his expression, but respect. And this distinction, faint as it was, struck a chord with Alice. The following week he returned, and in the other two. Gradually, Alice began to confide fragments of her story, testing Leonardo's confidence. The lawyer was astonished at the level of cruelty she had undergone. It was impermissible for him that someone should be thrown into an asylum, sedated and with all his possessions usurped. Then he made Alice a simple promise: "I will help you." Leonardo returns at night to the car, breathing heavily, full of thoughts circling. He had in his hands what seemed to be a big bombshell, documents that confirmed the restaurant chain was still active, but in Gabriel's name. Alice's signatures were shapeless, clearly forged. There the real battle began. Leonardo began to investigate every detail: bank records, accounting transactions, agreements that Gabriel had closed with suppliers. He talked to doctors who attested that Alice, at the time of these signatures, was hospitalized and under the intense effect of sedatives. She would not be able to authorize anything. It was enough to put together a solid dossier and find a way to take this case to court. Meanwhile, Alice, strengthened by the idea that someone had finally believed in her, found a remnant of strength to react. She asked to reduce her medication, arguing that she felt suffocated. With little tricks, he pretended to take some pills but discarded them. His reasoning was returning to normal. Depression, while still raging, is no longer a constant fog. And on each visit of Leonardo, she learned the details of the investigation and nourished a small flame of hope in her chest. One day, Leonardo brought more promising news. He had met the restaurant chain's accountant, a man named Rogerio, another secondary character, who confessed to having been coerced by Teodoro and Gabriel to defraud several balance sheets and reports. He had evidence and was willing to testify on Alice's behalf, provided he received protection and initial anonymity. He was the key to unmasking father and son. Now, Leonardo and Alice's challenge would be to articulate the next steps without arousing suspicion. They knew that Teodoro had the resources and contacts to suppress any scandal, and Gabriel, despite being more emotionally fragile, remained confident that he was above the law. They needed to be fast and strategic. To further strengthen the case, Alice realized that she needed to find old allies again. People who were once by her side, but drifted away in the face of the sudden disappearance of the owner. She got the contact of Beatrice, former manager of one of the group's most famous restaurants. Beatrice remembered Alice fondly, and how she had always been a fair, friendly, and supportive boss. She was shaken to learn what had happened and promised to help her with everything she needed. Other names came to light: Felipe, the chef responsible for the most successful dishes, and Roberta, who took care of the administrative part before Gabriel took over. Both had noticed something strange in the management of Gabriel and Teodoro, but they had no proof, and feeling displaced, they had resigned or been forced to leave. With Alice's rapprochement, they were willing to cooperate, ready to testify about the true personality of the owner of the restaurant chain and the abusive way Gabriel had taken over. In a rented, discreet room with no logos or large windows, Alice and Leonardo found this group of loyal former employees. It was an exciting meeting. Alice was still in the wheelchair, but now, with her head held high and her gaze steady. People wept when they saw her. They didn't know that her situation was so devastating. She, in turn, thanked each one for the courage to show up. There, they drew up a draft plan. 1. Collect testimonies from everyone who witnessed fraud or heard suspicious statements. 2. Validate forged signatures with legal experts. 3. Bring to court a robust process, with no loopholes for manipulation. However, Alice knew that there was little time before Theodore and Gabriel realized something. And if they did, they could start a wave of threats or bribes. They needed to anticipate the coup, to surprise the traitors before they hid behind powerful lawyers. Teodoro was already beginning to suspect. The company received discreet subpoenas, and some contacts began to refuse to sign documents without confirmation. Gabriel, under pressure, called the asylum seeking information about Alice, but could get nothing more than a "She's in our care, sir." That made his heart freeze for a moment. Was Alice trying something? Had he escaped? Teodoro tried to calm his son, saying that they had everything under control, but he knew that the siege was beginning to close. Meanwhile, Leonardo finished the dossier with unquestionable evidence: adulterated contracts, medical reports confirming that Alice was doped at the time of the alleged signatures, statements from employees and bank statements indicating illegal transfers to accounts linked to Gabriel and Teodoro. The more the pieces came together, the stronger the case became. Leonardo, in partnership with other reliable lawyers, filed the lawsuit, asking for the annulment of all the acts that harmed Alice, the restitution of the assets, and, mainly, the request for criminal liability of Gabriel and Teodoro. The strategy included not only financial recovery, but also prosecution for fraud and mistreatment. After all, Alice had been involuntarily hospitalized, under constant sedation, and held practically captive. Alice's anxiety was immense. Although he had regained some of his lucidity, his body still did not obey as before. He was physically vulnerable. At times, she woke up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, reliving the accident and the indifferent face of Gabriel, who used to kiss her morning and night without fail. He wondered, how can someone change so much? At what point did I lose the man I loved? Leonardo supported her not only as a lawyer, but as a friend who understood her pains. When he was not immersed in piles of documents, he made visits to the small room she still occupied in the asylum, as they had no alternative to immediate shelter. There they talked about future possibilities, about what they would do when she got everything back. These dialogues brought flames of hope. Alice's face seemed, little by little, to recover the brightness of before. Finally, the initial hearing was scheduled. It looked like one of those movie sets. The courtroom full, the press curious about the businesswoman abandoned after an accident. In the center, Gabriel and Teodoro side by side, but with different faces. Gabriel sweated and looked around like a cornered animal. Theodore, rigid, kept an expression of contempt, as if he were ready to question everything and everyone. Alice arrived in her wheelchair, accompanied by Leonardo. In the rearguard, Beatriz, Felipe, and Roberta, as well as other supporters. Upon seeing her, Gabriel disguised his surprise with a throat clearing, but his eyes could not face her directly. Teodoro, on the other hand, pressed his lips, without showing any apparent emotion. When Leonardo began to expose the evidence, the atmosphere became suffocating. Document after document, testimony after testimony, everything showed that Alice had been drugged, isolated, and that the signatures that transferred the estate were clearly forged. The mentions of Teodoro and Gabriel's direct orders to change reports, dismiss employees loyal to Alice, and embezzle money provoked reactions of indignation in the audience that followed. Gabriel and Teodoro's lawyers tried to argue that Alice had agreed to everything for her own good, and that the internment in the asylum was just a place of care. But that narrative sounded increasingly ridiculous as the evidence emerged. Among them, reports attesting to absurd levels of sedatives in Alice's blood, as well as dates of signatures and periods when she was hospitalized in a semi-conscious state. Leonardo asked for the floor to call Alice to testify. She took a deep breath. His legs were numb, but his heart was beating strongly. With a trembling voice at first, she told how the day of the accident had been. The daily disappointment of seeing Gabriel walk away, the pain of being abandoned, until she reached the fetid asylum where she felt buried in life. The report plunged the court into solemn silence. When she finished, Alice raised her face, staring at Gabriel for the first time directly, but without uttering insults. His gaze now had no haughtiness. It was fear. Theodore tried to stand up, accusing Alice of cheap sensationalism. The judge slammed the gavel, asking for order. It was clear that the father-son letterhouse was falling apart. The sentence was not long in coming. Later that afternoon, the judge decreed the immediate return of all assets and control of the restaurant chain to Alice. More than that, he declared the opening of criminal proceedings against Teodoro and Gabriel for fraud, falsification of documents, embezzlement, and mistreatment. Their lawyer could no longer argue anything consistent to free them from severe consequences. As the verdict echoed through the room, Alice felt a lump in her throat melt away. A wave of emotion ran through his body. Tears flowed silently. Leonardo, next to her, shook her hand, also moved. Finally, justice was being served. In the days that followed, Teodoro and Gabriel began to face legal consequences. Meanwhile, Alice was finally able to leave the asylum. He received support from Leonardo to rent an adapted, more comfortable apartment, and there he began a serious process of physiotherapy and psychological recovery. It would not be easy to forget months of neglect, but each day brought a new victory. The restaurant chain, now back in the hands of the true owner, was undergoing a general cleaning in the administration. Beatrice returned to managing teams, Felipe took over the main kitchen, and Roberta was in charge of checking all financial processes. Each one felt motivated to regain the credibility and joy that once defined Alice's enterprise. Alice herself made sporadic appearances in restaurants, always in her wheelchair, being received with applause and affection by the employees. Although the routine was still a challenge, she felt alive. He made a point of showing that he was still strong, even without being able to walk. "My legs may not obey me, but my heart remains firm," he said to those who asked about his condition. Teodoro, trying to escape more serious punishments, tried to bribe witnesses or convince them to change their testimonies. But Leonardo acted quickly, guaranteeing protection to the key people in the case. Gabriel sank into regret, for he was not as cold as his father. He tried to contact Alice a few times, sending confusing messages, alternating guilt and resentment, but she refused to answer. I needed to move on without looking back. Meanwhile, Alice's evolution in physiotherapy was slow but steady. She met with doctors who presented her with experimental treatments, giving her some hope. But even if she didn't walk again, she was determined to adapt. He had a company, friends, and a new will to live. Leonardo became much more than a dedicated lawyer. Their closeness to Alice increased as they shared legal victories and intimate moments of vulnerability. One complicity united them: the desire to confront any barrier in the name of justice and human dignity. The conversations became more personal, the smiles more frequent, and feelings were born that both did not foresee. After all the dirt left by Gabriel's management, Alice and her new team reorganized each sector. They improved salaries, brought back the welcoming atmosphere, and invested in publicizing the return of the true owner. The story of overcoming reverberated in the media, and this attracted curious people and customers who wanted to support the rebirth of restaurants. Beatrice, who now helped organize events, started to promote themed dinners with live music and special menus. Felipe, always creative, created new dishes, baptized with names that honored Alice's strength. Roberta made sure that the finances were unquestionable, cleaning up any trace of fraud. The public responded positively, and revenue grew again. In parallel, the criminal process against Teodoro and Gabriel continued. They tried to delay the inevitable, but each appeal denied brought them closer to a final verdict. The image of both was publicly burned. Teodoro, once considered a respected businessman, now found himself labeled a ruthless coup plotter. Gabriel, once celebrated as the perfect son-in-law of a powerful family, was seen as a traitor and a coward. After a while, Alice realized that she felt something different in her body. Fatigue, nausea in the morning, strange sensations that I had never experienced. When she took tests, the news came that would change everything. She was pregnant. The shock was immense because, in the midst of all the chaos, she and Gabriel had had some intimate encounters in the past, before he disappeared. A part of her heart was filled with fear, because that child was also someone who had hurt her deeply. But at the same time, there was a beam of light there, a life that was not to blame for his father's mistakes. Revealing the pregnancy to Leonardo was tense. They were getting closer, effectively, but that baby was not the result of this new bond. However, upon hearing Alice's confession, Leonardo was understanding and willing to stand by her. That posture further solidified the affection that Alice had for him. With the pregnancy in progress, Alice needed to redouble medical care. The risk was great, given the sequelae of the accident and his condition of paraplegia. However, each ultrasound gave him the strength to continue. She looked at the black and white images and saw hope, proof that her life wasn't over the day it all fell apart. The day of the final sentence against Theodore and Gabriel came. The court was teeming with journalists. Alice was unable to attend due to medical recommendations. Her health was fragile. Leonardo represented her. The evidence was irrefutable. The defendant's attempts to manipulate only aggravated the sentence. Teodoro received a sentence in a closed regime. Gabriel, also convicted, had a slightly lower sentence, but enough to pay for the crimes. He left the room in handcuffs, avoiding looking at any camera. Leonardo, back at Alice's apartment, brought the news. "They were sentenced. You're free." Alice felt a mixture of relief and sadness. There was no joy in seeing someone going behind bars, but I knew it was justice being served. The marks Gabriel had left on her soul would remain, but at least he could no longer harm her. And Teodoro, this cold man who orchestrated much of the plan, would also pay dearly. As her belly grew, Alice found herself more and more involved in Leonardo's care and attention. Their relationship blossomed naturally, two people who met in the midst of storms and decided to stay together. The baby was a constant reminder of everything she had experienced, but also of how life has unpredictable paths. On many early mornings, Alice woke up with back pain, and Leonardo was there, massaging her, preparing tea, or just holding her hand until she went back to sleep. At work, she remained active, participating in video conference meetings, talking to important clients, giving guidance to the team. At the same time, she planned a management model in which she did not depend so much on her physical presence, in case she needed to be absent to take care of her son. With this, she and Beatrice idealized a new organizational structure, focused on shared leadership. Each month, the restaurant chain strengthened. New units reopened, old employees resumed posts. A sense of belonging pervaded everyone. The audience admired the trajectory of overcoming Alice, who, in a wheelchair and about to become a mother, showed the world that persistence is the biggest key to success. On a morning with intense blue skies, Alice felt strong contractions. Even though she had prepared herself psychologically, she was overcome by fear and excitement at the same time. Leonardo took her to the hospital, where the medical team was already on hand for an emergency cesarean section, as the condition of paraplegia carried additional risks. The hospital corridor seemed endless as they pushed the stretcher. The white lights flashed over her head, and all Alice could hear was the racing sound of her heart. The birth was tense. At times, complications seemed to arise, but the team acted quickly. Then, after minutes that seemed like hours, the newborn's cry echoed in the room, bringing everyone a feeling of relief and happiness. Alice cried copiously, unable to believe that, after all she had experienced, she was there, holding her baby in her arms. It was a boy. Her eyes were closed in a powerful cry that soon filled the sterile silence of the operating room. Leonardo, moved, kissed Alice's forehead, and then watched the baby, amazed by the miracle of life. At that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the threats, not the lawsuits, not the old pains. It all came down to that little being who arrived to bring light to such a dark past. As the weeks went by, Alice adapted her baby care routine. There were moments of pure tiredness, but also of a joy she had never experienced before. The boy was healthy, exuded vitality, and every little progress of his, a smile, a babble, a move of his arms, renewed his mother's energy. Leonardo remained by Alice's side, helping her to balance the demands of mother and businesswoman. Although he was not the biological father, he loved that child genuinely, and this was evident in every gesture. The apartment now had toys in the corner of the living room, diapers scattered around, and a home atmosphere that had previously seemed impossible. One late afternoon, Alice decided to take the baby to visit one of the restaurants that reopened. When she got there, she was greeted with applause. Employees and customers stood up in respect for the story of overcoming that she represented. Moved, Alice lifted her son in her arms and felt a warmth in her chest, a feeling of mission accomplished. Or perhaps it was a new beginning of the mission, because there was still a lot to build. The marks of the past would never disappear completely. It would still be necessary to deal with memories of the accident, the asylum, and the betrayal. But now Alice had true allies, faithful friends, and a fresh perspective on what really mattered in life. She had chosen not to live bitterly, but rather grateful to have survived and to be able to start over. His restaurants were much more than a business. They were welcoming spaces, places that told stories of overcoming, love, and companionship. Each dish on the menu celebrated the human ability to turn things around. And above all, Alice proved every day that, regardless of tragedies, human beings can get back on their feet, stronger and more aware of their own value. On a night to celebrate the anniversary of the first restaurant unit, Alice climbed onto a small platform adapted for wheelchair users to speak. With her voice choked with emotion, she thanked the people who believed in her in the most difficult moments. She also thanked Leonardo, who held the baby in his arms, smiling proudly. The audience, made up of employees, customers, friends, and family, remained in absolute silence, absorbing every word. "If I've learned anything on this journey," she said, "it's that the real failure is not in falling, but in not wanting to get up. And I got up. We can all get up if we have the right people by our side." The applause came intense, loaded with admiration. It was the final chapter of a dark phase and the beginning of a tomorrow full of light. Alice there, with a wide smile, holding a microphone with her firm hand, proved that no wheelchair could limit her spirit, that no betrayal could defeat his essence, and that, even after so much pain, there was room for new beginnings, for new stories, and for the unconditional love that was born in her heart, and now multiplied in that son who slept peacefully, cradled by a future full of hope.